Okay, I was asked to talk on the resilience of the internet interconnection infrastructure because that's something on which we've recently done a bit of work for ENISA. I'd like to start off by saying that I do indeed agree with what the first speaker was saying. We have for many years at Cambridge been working to try and make security engineering into a proper discipline. And what we found is that this is not just about cryptanalysis and the theory of operating systems. You also have to do microeconomic analysis and game theory to try and figure out who's got an incentive to do what to whom. We've been doing security economics for a decade, and psychology off and on for quite some time, but particularly over the past 4 or 5 years. Bringing together the engineering, the economics, and the psychology is what this business is all about. I should also say that I agree with the second speaker in that you have to measure crime and understand it. The latest figures that we've been pulling together indicate that something like 6% of PCs in Britain are running malware at any one time, and we're interested in collecting all sorts of data on the life cycle of that, and how machines get owned, how they get cleaned up, what are the costs and what are the incentives. Now, what this comes down to is that when we try and model crime and conflict, when we try and understand the real and potential enemies, we find that systems often fail because the people who guard them, or who could fix them, don't have the right incentives. For example, in some countries, banks find it easier to dump fraud risk on merchants or cardholders because consumer protection laws are poorer. And where that happens, we find that fraud increases. In countries with poor protection like Britain and Spain and Latvia, the Eurostat statistics show quite clearly that we've got more fraud than places like America or the Netherlands or Finland, where there's better protection. And this applies also to dependability, because in the business of electricity generation, for example, there's always the question of what happens if there's a sudden surge, if 5 million people get up all at once to put the kettle on. If you don't have some spinning reserve, then you're going to have a blackout. And who's going to pay for the spinning reserve? In other words, both security and insecurity are things that emerge as a property of large and complex systems. You can see them as being externalities, like environmental pollution, in that just as somebody who lights a coal fire in his yard doesn't face the full economic and social costs of that, similarly somebody who connects an insecure PC to the internet doesn't bear the full social costs of that. If your machine is owned, you won't notice. The bad guy will patch your machine so that nobody else takes it from him. He will use it at such a rate that it's not an inconvenience to you, so that he can use it for as long as possible. Of course, the harm is accruing to others. So this means that we have to look at the economics of how our trade works and what makes it different from, for example, the market for coal or the market for potatoes. And IT product and service markets tend to be different because of 3 big factors. Firstly, there's network effects. The bigger a network, the more valuable it is to each individual participant. This leads to networks rapidly growing once they reach takeoff point, whether it's the phones in 1900 or fax in 1985 or email in 1995 or Facebook 3 years ago. This is how it goes. Second, there are low marginal costs. Once you've built your system, adding an extra user or even adding an extra million users is usually pretty cheap. And finally, there's technical lock-in. And there's also social lock-in now with social networks. How can you challenge Facebook when people already have their friends there? People will want to be on the network that their friends are on. Now, these 3 features taken together are why our industry is so full of monopolies. They also enable us to understand why there are so many security failures. Because if you're Microsoft fighting Apple in 1985, or for that matter Symbian fighting Palm in 2005, or Facebook fighting MySpace 3 years ago, what you've got to do is to appeal to the complementers. That means that you keep it simple, you keep it open, you keep it insecure, and once you've won your race for market share, you lock it down later. So the old Microsoft saying of ship it Tuesday and get it right by version 3 is quite rational. In other words, poor security is often rational from the point of view of the platform owner. Another deep problem afflicting our field is asymmetric information. It's well known that if one party to a transaction knows more about the quality of the goods or services than another party, then the market will fail. Used car markets fail because sellers know whether the cars are good ones or bad ones and buyers don't. So buyers have to assume that the cars are bad ones. That's why your car loses a third of its value when you drive it out of the showroom. And you get adverse selection. Sick people buy more insurance and crooked companies buy more ads. The top Google ad, for example, 5 years ago, was twice as likely to be malicious as the top editorial search result. Why? Because if you're somebody reputable like Marks and Spencer, you don't have to advertise, but if you're running a scam in Ukraine, then why not? Now, can you fix this with certification? The old idea in the old days was that you could fix asymmetric information by having a certification scheme. Volvo approved used cars. Common criteria, anyone? Well, hey. We did an interesting bit of work 3 or 4 years ago when we looked at what was happening with pin entry devices. Some of you may have seen the videos of this. And it turned out that the pin entry devices that you commonly find in the UK were trivial to tap. This is the Ingenico, which is Britain's most widely deployed unit. It's got a little cubby hole in the back. And if you drill just up at the top left-hand corner, you can drop a paperclip onto the serial line between the pin pad and the smart card, which takes the pin in one direction and the card details in the other. So everything that you need to make a magstripe clone for use in America or Thailand or whatever can be harvested easily. Now, these were supposedly common criteria evaluated against a protection profile which said it would take $25,000 to break a single unit. That turned out to be bogus. And unfortunately, Cheltenham wasn't prepared to defend its brand. Visa was claiming that these were common criteria evaluated when they'd never in fact been certified. Within a few months, we actually found that bad guys had got access to the supply chain in Dubai, and they were fitting GPRS equipment into PEDs that were en route from the factory in China. So it was possible to go into a branch of ASDA in the UK, or for that matter, a branch of ABN AMRO Bank in Rotterdam, and to use a new out-of-the-box pin entry device that stole your card details as you used it. What's even worse, the two bad guys who did this were supposed to be tried last October, but at the end of the day, they got off scot-free because the banks weren't prepared to collaborate with the Crown Prosecution Service in putting them behind bars. That's an example of the sort of serial institutional failures which makes it really, really difficult to push back on cybercrime. So, part of the fix for this is at the technical level. And during the 90s, colleagues and I rushed off and invented protocols and algorithms and all this sort of stuff. But we realized by 10 years ago that there's a policy aspect to it as well. And back in 2008, the European Network and Information Security Agency got us to have a look at what the regulator could do. What should governments, in particular, what should the European Commission do in order to try and fix these problems? And we come up with a number of recommendations, some of which are being made into policy. First, a security breach disclosure law, like you have in most of America, and that's being worked on as part of the data protection regulation that's being pushed through Brussels at the moment. Second, EU-wide data on financial fraud and electronic crime. That should be fixed largely from later this year, where the Banque de France's Observatoire will be collecting fraud data from all the Eurozone member countries. So instead of having 3 countries publishing fraud stats, we should have 18. Next, European-wide data on which ISPs host malware, things like spam sources, proxy services, and illegal hosting, are things that can be observed. And if you're a big company like Yahoo or Google or Microsoft, you've got these numbers. But of course, none of these companies want to publish those numbers. Wouldn't it be nice if the government did so? Because this would shame certain large companies into being a little bit more eager to help their customers clear up. Next was an EU-wide body to facilitate cooperation on cybercrime. And in fact, if you've been observing the stuff coming from Brussels, there's a consultation out on that at the moment. So there's the background, and the thing that I was particularly asked to talk about today was how does this affect infrastructure? In particular, how does this make it more or less likely that a bad person or a freak natural event could cause the internet to not work, leaving your business high and dry? Well, we already know quite a lot about the dependability of infrastructure. In Britain, for example, we have got a system whereby when power companies buy and sell electricity on the spot market, the national grid raises a tax on that, and they use that to buy the extra capacity, the spinning reserve, that's needed to provide the overall system dependability. Because without that, you would find that there were an awful lot of power cuts during the advertising breaks in cup finals and at times like that. But what about the internet? Do we perhaps need to do something about the internet? Well, last year we published a report, Resilience of the Internet Interconnection Infrastructure, which looks at the core of all this. And this was done for the guys at ENISA, and my colleague Chris Hall actually wrote most of it. He used to look after peering and transit at Scottish Telecom, so he spent several years in the front line and understands in detail how the business works. And the main takeaway message from this talk is that you should go and download this report and read it. Because unless you've spent the last 10 years in a network operations center, there's an awful lot that you'll be able to learn from it. It's 240 odd pages, but if you don't have a long plane flight sometime in the next few months, don't worry, we've got an executive summary of 30 pages or so, which has got the main meat. Now, the dependability of the internet infrastructure is all about how ISPs buy transit, organize peering, and use internet exchange points like links. And the resilience of the internet depends ultimately on the economics of all this. Firstly, will ISPs have sufficient incentive to secure their own systems? Second, will the system as a whole come to the kind of equilibria where there's enough surplus capacity that most of the time we'll be able to cope, that we'll keep the internet up at least 4 nines, if not 5. Now, what sort of things could break the internet? We've done a bit of work on this, which you might find useful from the point of view of your contingency planning. First, if we lose technical infrastructure that we rely on, like mains electricity, then of course the internet will go down. A second possibility is that if we've got a flu pandemic, so that people can't get to work anymore and maintain the infrastructure, we could have failures, because even although guys like us can work from home, the same isn't necessarily true of guys in electricity substations. So grid goes down, see case 1 above. The third thing that we worry about more and more is organizational failure, because 2 years ago when we started this work, the internet transit market was basically run by 20 large companies, which had approximately equal shares of the market. And if any one of them went belly up, then so what? The traffic could flow elsewhere. But the transit market became uneconomic because of price competition, and this led to consolidation, as you probably know, with level 3 chewing up over a third of it. And if level 3 were to go down, or if for that matter Akamai or Google's content network were to go down, then that would cause serious problems. Does this mean we have to regulate? Well, maybe not yet, but maybe sometime there will be an incident that causes the politicians to want to do something. And when they decide they want to do something, then we better see to it that there are things for them to do that aren't catastrophically stupid. Now, what other things could cause politicians to want to do something apart from organizational failure? Well, you've got bugs. A significant number of route leaks that we've had up till now have been due to various kinds of bugs and blunders. And the cut over to IPv6 offers the opportunity for lots and lots of stuff to break in really interesting and complicated new ways. And then finally, of course, as we're security guys, we worry a bit about attacks. What happens if an innovative bad person decides to take down the internet? We used to say, well, what happens if the man in bin Laden's cave decides to destroy the evil West? Or the Iranians decide to bring down America in response for trouble in the Straits of Hormuz? Or perhaps an equally realistic scenario, some bright geek working for the militant wing of Greenpeace thinks that modern civilization is destroying the planet, so we should all go and live in tents and wear vegetable sandals. So he decides that he's going to write some malware that uses 0-day and Juniper routers and causes them to broadcast and tear down large numbers of bogus routes, which in turn tears up the routing fabric, and all of a sudden you don't have an internet anymore. And perhaps many other things fail too. Perhaps you find in many countries that even the plain old telephone system doesn't work because it's moved to IP. Perhaps in some countries they find even their governmental and military networks don't work because these are just VPNs layered over good old-fashioned internet. So all sorts of very interesting things could happen if an attack like that were carried out. So what should we be doing? Well, you can read all the gory details in our report, but we find that many of the ideas in our original cybercrime report come round again. First, we don't have an awful lot of data on the things that go wrong because people tend to hush them up, just like banks hush up big credit card incidents. So the first thing would be an independent body to investigate major incidents and to report on them publicly. Then, what we need to do so that we can do decent engineering is to collect consistent, comprehensive, and long-term network performance data. There are a couple of companies who do this on a commercial basis, but it's not their main focus, and there are always research projects to do it, but they tend to become time expired when the student gets his PhD and goes away to get a proper job. Once we've got decent data, we can start getting better metrics. What do you mean in your business by the internet working? If you're a cloud service provider, then you probably want 5 nines availability, at least during the business day. And if your business is all about helping people to communicate with their relatives overseas, then maybe 2 nines are enough. If you're in the business of providing streaming media or providing VoIP service, then you require low latency. If, on the other hand, you've got a website offering bargains, then the odd outage for a second or 3 won't matter to you at all. There's no agreement, in short, on what resilience means. The big technical challenge that the US Department of Homeland Security is funding at the moment is BGPsec, ways to develop secure inter-domain routing, and the big problem here is how do you get incentives for deployment? How do you persuade the first few large transit providers to turn on BGPsec? Because it's a little bit like having sprinklers in an apartment. The first few people who put a sprinkler in the apartment don't get much benefit from it because their flats may still burn down because of a fire elsewhere. It's only once most of the flats in the apartment block have got sprinklers that the remaining laggards feel the full incentives. So incentives are important. So are things like contingency plans. What should regulators do if the transit market fails? What about independent testing of equipment and software? That's beyond the capabilities of most corporate users. What about best practice? Even typical small ISPs don't really keep up with best practice the way the big guys do. On the governmental side, the sort of things that ENISA is keen on doing is having regular pan-European exercises where they imagine that there was an attack from China or from Greenpeace or whatever, and they can war game and get people talking together and check up their contingency plans. And then there are political things to do, like thinking about traffic prioritization. If you had a crisis, then perhaps one of the first things that the British civil service might be prompted to suggest is turning off people's mobile phones, or turning off Twitter, or turning off YouTube. Remember the riots? Now, I can't think of anything that's more likely to inflame people into panic than by blocking their means of communication. So we perhaps need a little bit more consultation and thinking about this. And finally, there's an issue of how do you certify resilience? When you guys go out and buy network service for your companies, how do you tell which of the various phone companies is more likely to keep their network up in the event of an attack? What sort of visibility do you have in that? At present, you've got 0. You're in the position of a guy buying a used car and hoping for the best. So what can we do about that? Well, there's other things we can do. There's some technical research we've been doing recently, for example, finds that most route leaks come from operator error. And so a big thing that you could do if you're a router manufacturer is make the routers easier to use. And there's lots of technical stuff like that. But there's also lots of policy stuff. And so what I'd encourage you to do is to go and read our report. Look at my webpage. That will give you links to my security economics webpage, which has got lots and lots of goodies on this. lightbluetouchpaper.org is our blog. If you're seriously interested in this topic, our annual workshop is in Berlin in June this year. And I've also got a book which you can get with all sorts of stuff on security, economics, and other good stuff. So, I might take a question or two if there's time.